Hey everybody, how's it going? And welcome back to Reading in the Dark. Byron here. I want to do what I hope will be the first of a series of favorites videos. So this is going to be a video where I go down a short list of categories for things that were my favorite of that thing from the month before. So this is October. We're relatively early on in October still, so I'm going to do my favorites from September. So the first category that I came up with on the short list is my favorite book cover. So I figured this can include books that I just bought in September. It doesn't necessarily need to include books that I read because the book cover has been appreciated already without my having read it. And I think going through all of the books from my spreadsheet that I bought in September and everything I read, my favorite cover, and there were some good ones, but my favorite one, I think, is probably just because it holds a lot of promise, is Sea of Rust. The cover for Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. This is a book about a bunch of robots sort of surviving in a desolate landscape post-humans, after the last human beings have died. And I have read short Goodreads blurbs that are kind of mixed. I've read good things and mediocre things about the book, but the cover is amazing. I love the colors. I love the robot hand and just the composition of the whole thing. I just think it's a really striking cover, and it's one of those where, like, I know the cover doesn't necessarily mean much, but based on the cover, I can't wait to read the book. So that was my favorite cover in September. My favorite character. So my favorite character that I encountered in my reading in the month of September would have to be, hands down, no question, the Devil from Hannah Green and Her Unfeasibly Mundane Existence by Michael Marshall Smith. The Devil is portrayed as a withered, tired old man in this book because there's something wrong with all of people's evil thoughts and all of the sacrifices that people are making to the devil. They're not reaching him anymore, so they're not empowering him the way they're supposed to. So he's weak. So he's kind of like a crotchety old man, but he still is the devil. And even though his power is being challenged by other devilish spirit people, he's still the devil. So I loved the way this character was written. I don't know what I expected when I read early on in the book that someone was going to be the devil, but this was not it. And it was really, really great. And I'm going to read a quote. He paused a moment, then smiled, causing the immediate death of a nearby mouse. What? That's just awesome. That's hilarious and kind of cute. So anyway, I love that character. Favorite relationship that I read during the month of September. Now, there were a lot of good ones. I kept trying to find an excuse to bring Blindness by José Saramago into this video because it was beautifully written in its own way, despite the misogyny and monotony and other unease that were rampant in that book. But I just couldn't come up with anything. I considered the relationship between the seeing wife of the ophthalmologist and the ophthalmologist himself in Blindness, but it just paled in comparison to this really short scene in a book that I didn't love, thriller, the big, very popular thriller, The Woman in the Window by A.J. Finn. The relationship between the narrator, Anna, I think is her name, and her neighbor, Jane Russell, who comes over. She comes over and visits with Anna. Anna, of course, is agoraphobic and won't leave the house, can't leave the house. And in a brief scene, Jane Russell comes over and they drink wine, they play chess, and they talk about their lives, and they talk about Anna's photography and why she gave up on it or why she sort of stopped. And Jane Russell encourages her to pick it up again. And on a whim during that conversation, she says, "You're right, I should." And so she has her iPhone, and even though she has a better camera, she just grabs her iPhone and takes a photo of the really pretty sunset through the window, and that becomes important later. But the scene is just really sweet, and I love to see a scene between two women. I don't know, they're just kind of chilling and hanging out and drinking wine and playing chess, and it wasn't high drama, it wasn't high stakes, it was just a nice scene. I just thought it was sort of charming the way they got on, and I really liked it. And I wish the scene had been longer. And so, strangely enough, of all of the books that I read in September, that relationship kind of stuck out in my memory. I'm also sort of struck by the relationship between the boy and the Persian boy, and one of the men who's preparing him to work for some king, I forget which one, whom he trains him basically in like sexual matters. But he's very, very kind, and he's very, very patient. And the boy slowly kind of falls in love with him, which is really adorable and very sweet. So I like that relationship as a runner-up. But for some reason, the just sort of whimsical, silly camaraderie between the narrator, Anna, and her neighbor, Jane, in The Woman in the Window stuck out in my memory. The book struck out. That scene did not. Okay, so then I want to do some of my favorite highlights from the month. This is from Hannah Green and her Unfeasibly Mundane Existence by Michael Marshall Smith. Something she liked about her grandfather was that if you wanted to talk, then he'd listen. But if you didn't want to talk, he'd listen to that too. Isn't that great? I love that quote. That's so sweet. I just put a heart next to it when I highlighted it. I just love it. What a lovely sentence. What a lovely idea. And then I do have a quote from The Persian Boy by Mary Renault. And this actually does relate, I think, maybe to his sort of perceived relationship with this older man who was training him. With such follies, the young, to whom each joy or trouble seems eternal, will concern themselves while the sky is about to fall. So that sort of speaks to the idea that when you're young, matters of the heart seem like the most important thing, even in the midst of other situations that are a much bigger deal, while the sky is about to fall. She's just her own thing. Mary Renault is just amazing. And then my last quote is also from Persian Boy. I had pictured an endless column of men, miles long, but the army was spread all over the plain, between the river and the hills. It was as if the land grew men instead of corn. Come on, Mary Renault. Okay, describing the scene, painting a picture. Isn't that great? What great writing. Y'all, if you can get through historical fiction, I love it. Some people don't. Mary Renault is the most amazing writer. And she was fascinating just in and of herself, but she's an amazing writer. And she writes sentences like this all the time. She just evokes these images so effortlessly, it seems. It was as if the land grew men instead of corn. And you can totally see it then when she says that. You're like, oh, huh, wow. And it becomes really impressive in my mind's eye to see the huge assemblage of men. So I just love her. Okay, so then I'm going to say my favorite writing style and anything that I read in September. I only actually technically read 2 books in September, and I've discussed this before. It was really sad. It was Hannah Green and Blindness by José Saramago. And I actually chose Blindness by José Saramago. José Saramago's writing style, of those 2, stood out as being really unique. He doesn't use much punctuation. He only uses commas to separate things. There's no quotes or hyphens or semicolons or anything. He just uses commas, and he rarely changes paragraphs. So there's very large chunks of text. And it's daunting to look at it. That said, I do think that the writing style is perfect for Blindness. It's perfect for the depiction of these people losing touch with their senses. They're feeling a little bit maybe overwhelmed, a little bit disoriented and fuzzy and lost in space, and they're sort of adjusting to not having sight anymore and losing all of these sort of like literary guideposts in terms of the syntax and how the book is written and the format of it. It has a really, really amazing impact on the way the story affects you as a reader. It turns out that was not some specific choice that he made for this book. And if it had been, then I might have said, wow, what a brilliant choice that was made. I think that was his style for most of his like mature writing period. There were definitely books that he wrote when he was younger. One that is actually previewed at the end of my ebook copy of Blindness written in a more normal style, but I think he's known for this writing style, so it's not unique to Blindness. But it works so brilliantly in Blindness, and even though it's hard to get used to, once you do, the book does kind of just flow over you. It was more the content of the book that I found disappointing, which is why I didn't give this book a great review. But the writing style is super unique and very, very great for the material. So that, of those two, it would probably be my favorite writing style among a much larger list. It happens to only be a month where I read 2 books, but even if it were a longer list, I think that I would still be choosing this. It's a very interesting writing style, one that I will not soon forget. My favorite book that I finished in September. So I only finished 2, and this one is pretty silly because then it's Hannah Green and Her Unfeasibly Mundane Existence by Michael Marshall Smith. Because I didn't love Blindness. And I didn't love Hannah Green either, but I liked it, and I wasn't actively angry with the book while I was reading it. It got a little slow, but I was having no problem getting through it. Whereas with Blindness, nope. So that's my favorite book from September. Next month, this will be a much more interesting question because there will be a competition among more than just 2 books. And then my favorite thing from last month that has nothing to do with books, my favorite non-bookish thing. I convinced a friend of mine to ride this thing in Orlando called the Orlando Starflyer, which is the world's tallest swing ride. So the Orlando Starflyer is this thing. And I knew I wanted to ride it when I saw it because I just love things like this. And I had the time of my life riding it. I rode it at night. I needed to ride it during the day. Basically, it takes you up really, really, really high. It's like, I don't even know how many feet, but I will put that on the screen. And you're just suspended by chains, and you're sitting down, and it just starts to spin, and then you slowly start to, fly out with centripetal force, one of those. And you're just up really, really high, and you see everything, and there's a breeze up there, and it's just like mildly terrifying, and I loved it. Yeah. That's the kind of thing I'm into. So anyway, that was my favorite non-bookish thing from September. And I guess I'm just going to let that be the list for this first video. I could probably come up with other things to talk about in the next one, but just as my inaugural favorites video, I will leave it there. So that's my video. If you thought this was interesting, then I'm glad because I think it's fun. And I might do this again every month. So if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. And consider subscribing to my channel if you feel so inclined. And until next time, I will be here in the dark reading. Bye, guys.